Everybody, welcome back to Addiction and the Three Principles. My name is Greg Suki. I'm here with Harry Durbitsky, and today we're going to have a group discussion on blind spots and setbacks in recovery. I guess a really vital topic to cover because it really applies to everybody, not even just in recovery. We all have blind spots in life, and they tend to become pretty evident when we're around people that like to share the things they see, so they tell you what's going on, and it's kind of nice to have that, though. We have a choice when people point out or things that we're doing that we maybe don't see. We can get upset about it, or we can kind of look at it and see the truth behind it. Do you have something to start off with, Harry?
Okay. Well, what came to me a few minutes before the show came on, Sid was always talking to me about, Harry, you've got to get rid of your bad habits. And I was very, very slow in understanding that. And I was especially slow in seeing, what do you mean bad habits? Could you give me something specific? And basically, I had these blind spots that were blocking the experience, the deep spiritual experience that I had originally on Salt Spring, but these blind spots were covering it, were interfering with my ability to express the pure spiritual message of Sydney Banks. And every time I would see something with regards to that, I would grow tremendously, but I wasn't very quick at picking up my blind spots. And so it not only held me back, but it confused me, because there were certain things that, like in our life, we come into and we could see we're not growing in certain areas. And when I was feeling that, I couldn't quite get around what it was that he was trying to allude to. So I'm going to describe two scenarios, one which aptly describes a blind spot, and one where I personally experienced a blind spot and what happened. And what I'd like on this show, honestly, guys, if you can get into it, was maybe you tell one or two of your stories of how you experienced the blind spot, and then it disappeared within that thing, because we're not only interested in knowing we have blind spots, which is obvious, we're also interested in how we can get so that they release and bring all this power of truth to us. Because obviously, if the ego is quieter or is broken, and Sid described it like this, there's bubbles, and his job was to pop the bubbles. Pop, pop, pop. That's our job too. Pop, pop, pop. And so the first example is a business example. I was doing some business consulting with this very young, ambitious, aggressive, really cool guy, his company. And he had a concept, and his concept was business. As long as it's business, it's good. And he was especially good at landing a lot of contracts. And his business was booming, except he seemed to have a cash flow problem. And so I went in there and I said, I want you to take me out for lunch. And I said, this is going to be the best lunch you pay for. And so he took me out to an expensive restaurant. We ate, and then I pulled out the numbers. And I showed him, for every $1 that he sold, it cost him $1.25. So business was booming, but he had a cash flow problem because his costs were more than what his sales price was. And that's when he finally saw that, he just had a big smile on his face, and he said, Harry, this is the best lunch I've ever had, paid for. And then I came back a year later, sales had gone down 50%. Profit had gone through the roof. And it was so much easier to manage and so on. That's an example of how we fool ourselves with our concepts and images and so on. Now, I'm going to give a personal example. So I'm going to give a first personal example, and then if somebody else could give another one, that would be really, really cool. Or just to talk whatever you like. But the second one was, I grew up with a very violent temper, extremely explosive temper. And I told this story before, but it highlights what a blind spot is and what creates the blind spot. And so I grew up, and my father was a great guy, very well liked, but he had a huge temper, and he was always exploding. And I thought it was normal. This was just life. You had stress, and you let it go, and you felt good. But you noticed that everyone around you didn't seem to feel too good. In fact, they were pretty pissed off. And I had trouble understanding that. I feel good, so what's the problem? I just needed to let this steam off and explode and so on. And that's what my dad had done. And so I thought that was very, very normal. And then one day, a native woman asked me to come and take care of her kid for the weekend in her house. She was going away. And I said, sure, I'll do that. This kid had a violent, explosive temper. And you could always see it coming on. It's like temper is really easy to see when it's coming. You announce it about 15 minutes before you explode, because you start to get into that stuff. And he just exploded. And while he was exploding, he started to express all these thoughts. And this was so cool. Everything, not 90, 100% of everything he said was bullshit. It was all wrong. And you could see he was just throwing it out. And all of a sudden I had an insight. And this was so interesting. And this insight was, I wonder if when I'm mad, I'm also 100% full of bullshit. Because in my mind, I was 100% correct. And on that moment, 95% of my temper dissolved. It disappeared. 95% disappeared. And when my daughter's husband hears stories about what I was like growing up, he says, "Are you talking about your dad?" He can't understand what she's talking about, because I'm with the kids. I'm so cool. I'm not saying 100%. Don't get me wrong. 95% has disappeared. And that's the power of a blind spot. If you can pop the bubble, you'll grow 1,000,000 times more than listening to Sydney Banks, because it's inside you. It's not about listening to Sydney Banks and getting off, because obviously when I was living on Salt Spring, I was listening to Sydney Banks, but I had all these beliefs. But this personal thing that I brought in from a little baby all the way up, that was internal inside of me. And when it disappeared, I became a lot nicer human being. So
I'm glad you brought up insights, because that's really the only way that we can get rid of the blind spots. And the insights are really, we hear a lot of people talk about, getting a deeper understanding or being more grounded in the principles or whatnot. The only thing you really need to know is that an insight is what changes things. And an insight comes from within. And it can only come when you are ready and willing to change, when you are not stuck on who you are and what you are, and when those things that define you, the story of me, the ego. It kind of leads me into, I saw recently, I got an email from somebody in the 3 Principles one, a practitioner, and this email made it really sound like you had to have a coach in order to get the three principles. And it's really, that couldn't be farther from the truth. And I'm not saying that coaching isn't helpful. It really can be, but it is not necessary. An insight can occur at any moment. But it only occurs when you're willing to let go of the ideas and the values and beliefs that you believe are true. Like Harry just said, the things, he thought he was 100% correct, but it was just this story going on in his head. It's like just think of how many times, each of us has had some kind of insight at some point. You can't be human without having some kind of insight. It just happens. How many times has somebody pointed something out to you that you were doing, that maybe annoyed them or whatever, and you just kind of shrugged it off and went, whatever. And then like what Harry just shared, he finally saw it in somebody else. And in seeing it in somebody else, he truly saw it within himself. And the insight just naturally occurred. He didn't have a coach there telling him that he was being an asshole. He had
easy, Greg, easy.
But you had your inner coach, your inner self told you that. That's the beauty of it. The three principles work. They just are. They're principles. They're laws of the non-physical world. And they're working whether we see it or not. We don't necessarily need somebody else like that, especially in that like a long-term paid coaching position. I honestly don't really agree with these 6-month or 1-year contracts that a lot of these coaches want to get people in on. I understand, if they're trying to do this for a living, they need to make some money. But to me, it puts this expectation that it takes time and it takes this effort to have an insight. It can happen at any moment. Just like in that story that Harry just shared. In an instant, he just saw it. It didn't take him a year of hard work with a coach. It just took him a split second of being open enough to see it. And that's what this is all about.
And it does bring up a very interesting point that in one level, you're alone. And it's your own experience with your spirit that is going to be the change. Because Mark and I were living on Salt Spring with Sid, and he's the best coach in the world. And there were in many an instance that was a drawback to us because we were caught up in beliefs around that whole experience. And Sid's message was always go inside yourself. And within that, he said, don't be a follower. And if you're a follower in the three principles, in my mind, you're missing Sid's message. And in the last conference, Elsie said the same thing. She said very distinctly that too much, Sid's message is it's inside you, it's inside you, it's inside you. The more you understand that, the more you experience that, the more you're going to feel this I amness that is who we are, that alive spiritual feeling inside of us. And without that, I don't think you can really experience the three principles the way Sid wants us to. And that's the other thing with a coach that's a little bit disheartening sometimes, is that they're only teaching a facsimile of what Sid Banks was teaching. Sid Banks is the real deal. And we've all grasped it at different levels. And Sid wants us to live our full spiritual destiny and our feelings of love and expression.
And when it comes down to it, the only insight that ever matters is your own. It's nice to hear about other people's insights. It's a good story and you can get a good feeling from it. But until you have that or any insight for yourself, it doesn't have any lasting effect.
And when we're in the addiction field, like when Mark and I go in tomorrow, we're in the addiction field, it's pretty obvious that we can say a lot of fancy words, but we're still looking for the person to have a personal insight to change their reality. That's when we see a feeling of hope come into the person, that's when we get excited, not when we speak great words of what, what we learned or something like that. We're looking for the person in addiction to be able to uncover their own blind spots and or to express a feeling of spirit inside of themselves that enriches them, makes them feel good. And when you see somebody walk in addiction and in the recovery center, often when they're coming in, they don't look too good. I'll be honest, they don't look too good at all. And so they're dragging their bums and they're in a serious reality. And to see that feeling of hope come into them, and to see that, and then it brings, the feeling of hope brings fresh insight into who they are. And of course, they're beautiful, they're wise, they're wonderful people. And every time they feel fresh and alive, what happens is they give me a boost. Wow, this is really what it's about. I feel love in my heart. I feel, oh, yeah, that's why I come here. I don't come here to feel good myself. I come here to see that beautiful feeling in them. And they want that more than anything. And all we have to do is the way Sid teaches it. And it's always in the feeling. It's always what he emphasized. No form, always in the feeling. When he first started talking to the psychologists, at first, he didn't change his talk. He still just talked Sydney Banks, what he understood. And then he added a line, which I mentioned before, how it relates to life. But if you're only talking about how it relates to life, that's not it. That's the form. And that's what Sid was not talking about. He was talking about the source before, not the ego, the good stuff. And I don't know how he had such patience with such dummies on Salt Spring Island, but I think he had no choice. There was nobody else who was willing to listen to him at that time. He had to take what he had. And then when he went into the field of psychology, he said, oh man, I have to go down. It's way down there, man. But that's where the people are at. I have to go meet them there. And that's what he did. He went down and then started to slowly lift. And they fought it tooth and nail because they had blind spots like crazy. And in reality, Sid Banks had a blind spot. He was not enlightened, and he had tons of blind spots. He had an insight, and all of a sudden he saw fresh and new with new eyes. And that was beautiful. That was beautiful. Changed the world, that one little insight. And that's what we're doing, bit by bit. That's what you're doing, Patty, when you're doing your program. You're changing the world. When you're going and doing your little program, it's changing the world. And the love it pours into you is just incredible because you're sharing what this thing cannot understand. That's what I want. I don't want, this thing is always trying to catch up to the feeling of love. This thing is always 2 days late, to seeing the reality of the moment type of thing. And I don't know when you step into a feeling what it's going to bring. All I know is that if I'm relatively quiet, upstairs, in other words, I'm not paying attention to it. It's going to be a very, very, very beautiful journey. And that's what happens is with the spiritual feeling of love. It pours in and it's a healing balm. And if they don't disturb it, if for the moment they're quiet within their minds, they experience, well, an unlimited journey. And that's, each one of us has had the privilege of having an insight, the privilege, but we still have blind spots to it. I have still blind spots to the original experience I had on Salt Spring. I'm just surprised how it keeps unfolding. It's just showing me something that is a forever journey. I never really realized that one insight was just everything. Everything's a little hard to grasp. So I guess there's another reason why we have blind spots, is because we're trying to understand the unexplainable, and our little mind is explaining it to us, and that's what's blocking us from being able to see the emptiness that Sid was alluding to. And
this really is something that it can't be understood intellectually, but it can be experienced. You know, when you have that insight, you get it, but it's not like, you can't really explain where it came from. You can't, you know, it's at least in my experience, almost impossible to really put into words. You find stuff that you think is close to it, and you say it, and then you go, nah, but that's not quite it. Because there's some piece to it that is way beyond anything that is intellectual. It's that true, deeper spiritual feeling. Yeah. It's the real mechanics of the three principles. That's what an insight is. That's that deeper thing that everybody seems to be seeking, where we want to go to these courses and get all these coaches and all this stuff to get this deeper understanding. There is no deeper understanding. There's a deeper experience. And an experience is what changes you. You can learn, oh, well, mind is the formless energy of blah, blah, blah. You can learn all that stuff and spout it off to people all you want, but it doesn't create that feeling. Only the feeling creates the feeling. And a feeling doesn't come from intellect. It doesn't come from knowledge. It comes from that experience.
When I was, I brought in a client was brought in Colombia and South America, where things are really happening for me. And I have 6, one of the things I do is a group of 6. And then we had an incredible first session. Then I asked in the second session what they saw. And all of them were stuck in their blind spot. They all recited the book of the 3 principles. Not one of them talked about the individual, had an insight or perception towards the individual. They had hidden their own thinking, their own insight, their own ability to see clearly by the book that they were expressing. And I started to say, well, what about Jose or George? And they had nothing to say about that. And as they were talking the book, the energy went down, got heavy. And of course, they wanted to talk about the problem that he had, which I said was no problem. and then I started to talk what I had seen. And then the feeling of lightness came in, and then the session took off like crazy. But they are very, very caring, beautiful people, but their blind spot is the book of the 3 principles. And that does not allow for you to be a free thinker. That doesn't allow for you to use your instincts. It's like going to a conference and having a set idea of what it's going to be like. That would be ridiculous. I mean, you're already full. If you're full of nonsense, where's the room for, as Greg was talking about, the expression and the experience? And that is only achieved through emptiness, not achieved through concept and beliefs. And so Dickens said very clearly, I liked one thing he said, lots of things I liked he said, of course, but I loved the way he described this thing up here. It's a concept maker. It's making concepts. And we believe those concepts. And that's what Sid talked about, beliefs. That's all the psychological word he used, Patty. He never used another psychological word. He just talked about, on Salt Spring originally, beliefs. And the first time I saw him, he said, watch your beliefs. And of course, it's still true right now. They hold us back like they always had. And what about me? What about my beliefs? And how do they let go? And of course, the joke is, if you do something about it, they don't let go. They hold on.
Well, I think what you're talking about now, Harry, is really relevant to that second part of the topic today, which is setbacks in recovery. When people go back to doing whatever it is that they were doing and had stopped, and that can only happen because the understanding that you have wasn't from an insight, it was from knowledge, it was from the intellect. That's the only way that can happen, because once you have that true insight, you can't see it another way. It becomes the new truth, the new norm. And that being said, it's okay. If you have a setback, it doesn't mean anything. You're not a screw up, you're not a bad person. You just went back to an old habit. And if you get right back on the new habit, you'll strengthen that new habit. We go through life with all these habits of thought that we've created. And that's all addiction is to anything. It's just a habitual thought pattern that we ourselves created. And that's really good news. If we created it, we can recreate it. That's the beauty of it. I created my own habits that led me to being 340 pounds and to being drunk every day and being high every day and all that stuff. And now I've created the new thought patterns that don't include that. But in that kind of process in between, yeah, you might go back to the old thought pattern. It's really no big deal. Just get right back to the new one. If you beat yourself up over it, if you try to figure out why you went back to it or anything like that, you're only reinforcing the old one. And an insight can change that in an instant. But don't sit around waiting to win the lottery when you could, earn a living type of deal. You can still work on changing those thought patterns. And if in the process you have an insight, it'll just instantly change. But that doesn't mean you have to wait for an insight. You can still take those little steps to change that thought pattern. And if you have a setback, let it go. And I really can't stress that enough, that this understanding, the three principles, having that experience, that deeper feeling, it has nothing to do with adding anything to you. It has nothing to do with learning something new. It's more about letting go.
One thing you said, by the way, I agree with everything you said. This changing, like doing something to change your thought pattern, that I don't understand personally. I don't actually see I see myself through the principles just shifting shifting perspectives and stuff. But I don't see myself working on thought patterns. I don't. That to me seems like content again.
And it is. There's nothing wrong with that until you have the insight. But does that mean that I should continue to fill my face with chocolate cake when I know that it's bad for me? Should I sit there every night and eat a chocolate cake until I have an insight? Or should I, not being hard on myself, when I say kind of working on it, kind of working toward it, it's not like being difficult with yourself and being hard on yourself for it. It's just, maybe just tonight I won't have the chocolate cake. Because the chocolate cake was a habit. It's something that I started. I felt bad one day and I decided to go get some chocolate cake and I ate it and I felt better for a little bit. And then eventually, it applies to everything. I'm just talking about chocolate cake. It could be drinking, drugs, sex, gambling, shopping, in any number of things.
I know, but it doesn't work like that for me, Greg. I feel when I'm out of balance, I can't avoid doing. It seems like I'm fate complete type of stuff, and when and then via insight or I become balanced, then those things, all those things that you say make sense. But somehow, when I'm out of balance, when I'm in a state of imbalance, even though I could say I don't want to do it, I do it.
Right, and that's the setback.
That's the what?
That's the setback we're talking about.
Oh,
or
that's
relapse or whatever you want to call it.
Okay.
But in between those moments, you're not like that all the time. Nobody is.
Oh, no, of course not.
Right, so in between those moments, we have the choice. We have the choice of what.
Are you sort of saying like obviously my mind is speeding up and I'm getting caught up in, the old past thing and I want to hit the fridge and stuff like that. And if I can see that, and then all of a sudden I shift to do something that quiets me down because I can't, at that point, my thoughts are out of control, would be overthinking. And then I head towards something that calms it down. And then, of course, when it calms it down, my wisdom starts to kick in, and I'm able to sit in it. I need to be able to sit in it, where I feel comfortable with myself. And once I feel comfortable with myself, then it's easy. Obviously, if you feel, could we even say that this overthinking is caused because you're not feeling comfortable with yourself?
Yeah, that's usually what it is.
Yeah.
It's usually caused by our expectations of ourselves and others.
Or disappointment or something. Yeah.
Well, you can't be disappointed without expectations.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Absolutely.
But what I'm talking about, from what I see in the 3P community, there tends to be the talk of the two extremes. Either you've got this clear mind and you're having insights and you're connected to wisdom, or you're totally clouded and you're just kind of lost in space. But there's so many variations in between. And those are the places where those habitual thought patterns kick in. And I might just open the fridge without even thinking about it. Next thing I know, I'm staring in the fridge and I have no clue why I'm there. So I've got a choice at that point in time. That's not a point where obviously I'm really connected to wisdom at the time, but it's also not a time when I'm totally disconnected. You know what I mean? It's an in-between place. And that decision is there, but that's one of those blind spots, is that we kind of tend to go with that subconscious thought pattern and continue that blind spot. But sometimes just by making that different decision, we can pop that bubble like you were talking about. We can stick a pin in it. And sometimes it can lead to an insight, because it kind of drops that story just for that instant.
So
like your story with your,
oh, go ahead.
like your
Anything that,
story earlier, when you saw that thing with anger, it's like for that instant, you kind of dropped your story.
oh, absolutely. It was a pure moment of pure quiet, pure silence that created this this very
Yeah.
interesting um, self-observation. And after that, my natural common sense just it took care of everything. It was if I'm lying to myself all the time when I'm angry, well, obviously I'm not that type of person who appreciates that. And I couldn't hold my head up high and say, well, I'm lying to myself and I'm okay with it. Uh, so my natural common sense just kicked in and just wiped the slate more or less clean. And after that, I became a different person, a much nicer person, and that was very gratifying. When you always are creating angry situations for yourself, and you're creating all this anxious stuff for other people, and all of a sudden it's a soft, calm, sharing, caring environment. Well, you start to like yourself more because you're not such an asshole anymore. You become, you know speaking about you guys only, by the way. uh, you know, you know you know so I just saw a slow ebbing uh, motion head in a different direction. And it was a direction that my natural common sense said, wow, that's what I've always wanted to be, was a nicer person. I wanted to be a person uh, where I felt comfortable in sit with my kids. And especially my kids. I wanted that to be there. And I certainly didn't appreciate the fact that I had injured them so seriously with my temper. And I traumatized them to a degree. So it was really, wow, this is this is definitely a step in the right direction. And and what's funny about it, Greg, is as it grew in momentum, it became the only way to be, where the other just sort of went to sleep, or just was not activated, because it just didn't make any sense anymore to me to be like that. I mean, if I was right when I was angry, that's one thing. But if I was wrong 100% of the time, that's, even I, the big, stubborn, thick, block-headed Harry Dubitsky, could see that wasn't so good. Yeah, so it was a very welcome thing. And that's one of the things that I want people to understand about blind spots and setbacks. It is a very welcoming thing to understand that you have them, and it's a very welcome thing to see that when they pop, they are really what Sydney Banks was expressing. You get to know yourself. You get to know what mind is. You get to know what spirit is. You get to have a connection that's different with humanity. And the funny thing with my kids is the more I help them, the more they help me, because they are naturally in the same state. All they wanted was a good dad. That's all they wanted, and they loved me, obviously. I still was a loving person, but when those bad habits, those blind spots disappeared. And I guess the other thing, Greg, it encouraged me, like, oh, this is good. Like sometimes, like someone gives you $1 million, you might say, yeah, that's cool. This was kind of like $1 million. I went, yeah, this feels good. I appreciated this I guess the word came to my mind, freedom, to be myself. God, it's so hard to be yourself. It's like, I can be anybody else, but can I be myself? And really, there's no greater gift. Hanging out with Sidney Banks taught you be yourself, because this guy was just an ordinary, fun-loving human being who loved gardening and building his fireplaces in his yard, and loved painting and making everything beautiful. And he loved sharing his books and his stuff that he had. But he was most joyous when I felt good, not when he was telling me all about this stuff, that I was actually getting something. And then he'd wonder, and he'd leave me see what I got to understand. And quite often, I got less than I thought because of Mr. Concept Maker. I had it, but Mr. Concept Maker started to come back in there, and turned out that I had a very rigid intellectual system, highly intellectual, unfortunately, in one set. And it really took a lot of dynamite to blow through all that stuff. Luckily, Sid Banks had dynamite, so it was,
But we all have dynamite.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That's the thing. We all have it. That's a big part of Sid's message, was that it's not him. What he saw, we all have. It's not, it's not like we should aspire to be like Sid. We should just be ourselves. We're already enough. We already have everything that we need to be happy, psychologically and spiritually healthy, functioning human beings. We don't need to wait for it. It's not coming tomorrow. It's not, it's not when I get this, I'll be happy. No, I can be happy with or without that.
We have, Chris has his finger up. I think that means something. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that the challenge in a way, Harry, I remember you saying something about having all these great insights, meeting Sidney Banks, but you also had some years where you didn't quite connect to the principles, or something happened.
No, I didn't see the principles clearly. Yeah. And then I had years of doubt because of the lack of movement in my life.
Okay.
Somewhere back there, it was still going like this. It was still moving back there, but up here, where all the activity was, there was doubt.
Yeah, because what I was thinking here was, people go to retreats, and Salt Spring Island is beautiful weather, beautiful surroundings, and nice people, and everyone's saying the same, and you have insights, and wow. But then you have to go back to the mainland at one point, or wherever that is. So I think kind of integrating or having this understanding in your ordinary life, I guess that's what's the real challenge is, to not. And in a way, that having an insight also, means that my ego needs to get out of the way. My habitual concept making mind needs to get out of the way for me to have an insight. But you can even make an insights become a form, yeah? So I see people going around saying, how many insights? I want more insights, Someone else had a lot of insights. I want that too. And you can have, it's like Pokemon, you go and how many insights can I catch? But to have an insight, you need to drop out of your ordinary ego state.
Well, it's funny. You the more you go into now, which of course is the ordinary, the easier it is to have insights leading you in your life. Yet what you're talking about, of course, is also true. Very easy to get caught up in images of what we think. And that's the biggest, if there's a blind spot in the human race and the psyche, it's the images that we think are true is definitely the ones that are holding us back the most.
I think
testify to that. And that's why the principles are so powerful, because they keep popping that balloon. No, it's not in the thinking. No, it's not in the thinking. No, not the thinking. Still not the thinking. No, not the thinking. And somewhere along the line, you just say, the hell with it. I'll just go with it, and I like it, And
for me, I think very often I get into two kind of form or ego if I feel insecure or afraid of something, or if I can't, something is too overwhelming. I start grabbing for form. I try to repeat something that I think will make me feel more safe, or and just exactly doing that gets you. You don't get an insight that way, So at different words, of course, because it's not in the words, but to have an insight, there has to be some kind of vulnerability. Acceptance of vulnerability, acceptance of that you don't know what's going on, that you don't know what to do, So, so at the point where I kind of, in a way, give up my habit, give up my habitual thinking, and that might feel like I'm giving up. That actually gives access to this good feeling. It gives access to an insight, because so I think it's not what the intellect or the intellectual ego likes, because the ego obviously likes to feel sure about things, feel that it knows what to do. Whereas an insight, if it has to be something fresh, I don't know. I have to be in this not knowing, in a way, because or it has to be a surprise. Otherwise, it's not an insight. It's just a construct again.
Yeah, I agree with that, Chris. The state of not knowing is the state of insight.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you're coming from something that's the past already. And, a word I love is neutrality. You have a sense of a feeling of neutrality, and thus you're not attached to anything. Obviously, when we reach that state of neutrality, when we're experiencing that, very easy to feel gratitude, beauty, wisdom, and see that insight is an expression from God. When you talked about nature last time, just a couple of days ago, stuff like that. Anybody else? Be good to hear a few others.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. sorry.
Yeah. Thanks. From what Chris said was right on, from my own experience. I think we get ourselves in trouble by taking our thinking too seriously in the moment, whether we're dragging judgments and regrets and expectations or whatever into the present, or how it happens. We just start giving too much energy to our personal thinking, and we don't stay neutral enough. Remind ourselves, that's one thing that is thank God for Sid's materials. For many people, it helps, just reminds a little bit. It's not something to be memorized, but from my own experience, it it was when I stopped trying to get something from a conference and just saw the incredible beauty, firstly, of some change that I saw in the couple who had been drug addicts on the street. I won't go into the whole thing, but I actually saw a young couple who in Minnesota who had been on the street and who had become entirely different people. It helps to see the change in people, see the beauty in it. What it is a feeling of being blown away by the beauty of the power that we have before, of touching being and mind before, it's not by trying to change our thinking. So Greg, you were sort of stepping a fine line there where, you're saying that common sense really is what helps you avoid going to that fridge again because you've already been that way. Anyway, I'm rambling around, but this beautiful feeling is what opened up, and I came back and was sharing it, and a little bit of sharing and seeing, and not being in yourself, just totally being blown away by the beauty of it. Gave me the gift of touching pure being, or as pure a being as I'd ever experienced. And then, for a period of time, and then how you come back, and then you're taken care of, like Harry says, you've always got that, and you never go back to the old way because you've always got that guiding you. You never take anything as seriously as you used to. The blockheaded days of just not hearing what's said, years and years on Salt Spring Island and elsewhere, many opportunities. Sid was giving opportunities all the time to people to spend more time with him, or to he was so giving, but you never saw it because you're so caught up in your head. And it's the same with everybody. So you start seeing that it's a universal thing, and everyone has an opportunity to pop into it, but they have to let their mind relax. And anyway, I'm rambling. So
that was nice, Mark. That was nice. Yeah.
So, but it's there all the time, isn't it, Greg?
That was nice.
Yeah. Anyone else?
One of the things that, oh, no, you go, Patty. Go ahead.
Okay, I think I'm not muted. I was just thinking of an insight that I had even before I had learned of the principles, and I was in a 12-step program, and the 8th step is where you make amends, or you make a list of people that you have harmed, and it's always really difficult. It's difficult for me and difficult for others to go through that process. But my sponsor, who was very wise, and I speak so fondly of her now, and 2 years ago I just wouldn't have. I had such a blind spot to other recovery approaches. But she reminded me that some of my parenting techniques or behaviors evolved around how did I look as a parent. So my children's behaviors were somehow a reflection of my ability to parent, and they did or did not make me look good. And so when I was in a challenging situation with one of my teenagers, and I'm looking back at how did I harm them, because I just went ballistic, totally ballistic, complete rage. And so that was the thing that I wanted to make amends for many, many years later. And I realized my rage was because I was worried that the neighbors would find out. It had nothing to do with her. It was all about me. And so when I finally did that, make amends to her at the encouragement of my sponsor, my guide, she said, yeah, Mom, I remember that time, and I was really looking for guidance at that time, and all you gave me was a lot of anger and hate. And I just about died. And I'm dying just thinking about it now. So even though I was completely blind to my parenting style, I'm just so grateful for that woman, my sponsor, to point these things out to me, so that I can now have a better relationship with my children. And their behaviors are no longer a reflection of me, because they have their own wisdom, and they have everything they need. And I just, such a blind spot to me until somebody pointed it out to me. And that was even before I knew the principles. And now the insights are like little, like you said, little popping things, but they're not major. It just, I'm so grateful for recovery, and just that means I'm grateful for the crap that happened before recovery too, because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for it. And my relationships with my children wouldn't be as pure as they are now.
I'm glad you brought that up, Patty. So it kind of points to something we were talking about earlier with the intellectual understanding of the three principles. You had an insight without any understanding. You don't need to know the three principles to have insights and to live a happier life. You had that insight, and it changed your relationship with yourself and with your children. It's such a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I don't know what I called it then, but I know what it is now, because it has been long lasting. It has never left me.
Wow.
And it led you to where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
So you could see, in a way, it actually led you to embrace the three principles, community, or whatever you've been, and the language. And that is what happened to Greg as well. He's speaking from himself when he says that, guys, because he had a very powerful spiritual experience, very powerful, way before he came into the three principle community. But what happened was, this is what he said to me, was that now I had a language that could explain what I had experienced, where before I didn't really have a way of talking about it. And so it brought him naturally to a place where he could express what he had experienced, because as he expresses it, he saw, wow, this thing is still moving in a very powerful way. It didn't just stop. And that's one of the things about an insight. It's not just, I got an insight and I fixed my problem. That's psychological, guys. Spiritual keeps going. I like that one better. I'm not interested in fixing my problem, even the temper. I'm interested in getting a deeper feeling of life. I like quieting down, where before I hated it. I don't, even though I'm I love quieting down, because it softens, it allows me to receive more. And, and when I see Greg with his experience, it's just was a launching point, really. High launching point, but a launching point. He's got the rocket, and he's going up into the universe. And as Carl Sagan says, there's millions and millions of stars up there, and universes and all that type of stuff. And if that's up there, imagine what's inside of us. The beautiful stuff. I feel like a baby rather than,
And what an insight does is it takes care of the cause, not just the symptoms. It's not really your problems going away. It's the original cause of those problems. It's like, that just popped into my head for some reason. Years ago, like in my 20s, I, for some reason, for a period of time, started having really bad leg cramps. And I would take all the different over-the-counter medications, tried stretching, icing, putting heat on it, tried all these different things, and it would only ever provide temporary relief. And then somebody told me at one point that the problem was I didn't have enough potassium in my system. So I started eating bananas, and guess what? All my leg cramps went away. I was focusing so much on the symptoms that I missed the cause. And an insight goes right to the core. It's like that banana for the cramps in your legs, you know, it goes right to the root cause. And then the symptoms don't even matter anymore. They just disappear on their own. You don't have to do anything about those symptoms.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it. It's, like I said, it gets to the true cause of it.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, what happens a lot of times with people, and whether they understand the principles or not, they'll get this incredible insight or this incredible feeling, and it'll change their lives. And they go, wow. But the tendency is to put it outside of themselves. Right? I had a friend that was having trouble with drugs and whatnot. And he told me a story. I hadn't seen him in a long time. And all of a sudden, he had this profound insight. And somebody said, well, that was Jesus talking to you. But now he's out there involved with the church. I understand now he's not involved with the church as much. But he kind of lost it a little bit there because he didn't realize that it was inside of him, whether it's the God inside of you or however. And he could have, it could have been explained that way. But it became an exterior thing that he gave the credit for when he just had his own incredible epiphany, because he was really on his way down and out. I won't get into details as he was telling me. So I think that's just really important. I think that's really important with the three principles again, and other other philosophies that point to the inside, that it's coming from you. That is so important. I mean, I don't think you can overstate it anymore, that you have that, and that gives you the power, and that's the powerful thing.
Yeah, so true. An insight is to see within.
Simple.
Yeah.
It shows you what's already there.
Yeah.
But sometimes people, like in conversations like this, can help jog something in me that makes sense. That whatever it is, I mean, it's completely unpredictable. And if I tried to recreate it, it would never happen. But there's just something I hear in the conversation that makes me go, huh.
And
Interesting.
that's why being in the moment with people, whether you're trying to help someone or you're just having a conversation, being in the moment, you come up with just sort of maybe the right thing to say or whatever. It's kind of like a comedian, the stand-up comedians, they get up in front of the stage, and to me, I think it's amazing. Like Robin Williams would get up and he'd kind of maybe have an idea what he was going to say, but he was waiting to be inspired. Now, he also had his regular material, he said, because sometimes he'd get up there, and I love the way he put this, it just sucks dead air. Nothing's coming. But if you can just sort of relax and wait, because especially if somebody's asking you a question and you really want to help them, you get that inspiration. Something will come up. And I loved it I'm reading Elsie Spittle's book, and she was at one of the conferences, and she got up there and she said, and I loved her honesty. She said, I just don't know what to say. I don't know, and then from that, something came up, but I loved her honesty in front of a whole group of people. She didn't try to fake it through or whatever. So yeah, and then again, Sid used to say too, you can find truth coming from anyone. But Patty, you're open for it, and that's just the main thing is to be open, and then it'll come from places you didn't realize, you know, or a door open that you didn't realize was there before.
She brings up a really good point that I really appreciate, Patty. The fact that we can hear truth in this just casual conversation that we're having here, and it just comes out. We don't need, like, one of the things Greg has mentioned, he's talked a little bit about it with me, is, you know, when we were doing our shows, where we were just the two of us doing shows, we were talking, and the general level of discussion was a little bit higher, and you have guests come on and they get everything is centered around. There does seem to get a little bit of a concept in people in the three principles that you have to hear it from Sid or from. In reality, that isn't Sid's message at all. It's the opposite. That in this just casual group discussion, as you mentioned, there's some. There's just this. There is. The power is in ordinary rather than concept, and this is ordinary. This is very ordinary, but as we know, like I looked at the time and I went, wow, it seemed like 15 minutes, and it was like, whoa. I went, boy, this was pretty soft, and you know you know, so it is not in even in reading Elsie's book and stuff. It's the fact that we're here now, we care, we're putting our hearts out to the best of our ability, and it's enriching and nourishing, and you know, and as I've started to talk with Greg lately, I've noticed like he's growing. So I'd say all of a sudden our relationship, the way we're talking is changing. And, you know, I went, oh man, he's coming. We're together, you know, like we're just doing our best, but we're together. We're on the same page. And that, you know, that felt really, really good. And here talking, you know, and when I talk to Thomas sometimes, what I've noticed is he'll say something to me that he has kind of a perception that kind of cracks me open a bit, because he says it with such honesty. And I go, oh, and it's worth a million conferences. I'll tell you that much. It's because it cracks open.
Right.
To see me and my blind spot, or I could think, oh, I'm the big shot. And of course, you know where that
was. Scott just shared. It was a much better worded way of saying what I was trying to say earlier. I had that feeling, but putting it into words it wasn't happening. What you were talking about with Robin Williams, he knew he was going to be inspired. He was going to have an insight when he was on stage, and he'd eventually get into it. But that didn't mean he didn't show up prepared. He still had some jokes to go up there and tell until the insight kicked in. That's really what I was trying to say when I was talking about doing something in the meantime. Don't just sit on your hands waiting for an insight. You still need to live life. And Sid talked about that all the time. Go out and live life. Insights will come. But I'm glad you said that, Scott, because that is definitely a much better way of wording it. You know, and Robin Williams, he's a good dude. You know, everybody's got their issues, but he's a loving, caring guy, and he knew that he would be inspired.
Yeah, Van Gogh was the greatest painter in the world, but he still pulled his ear off.
So let's not pull any ears off today.
Nice gruesome image.
This has been awesome, guys. Thanks everybody for showing up and for joining in the conversation today. Really, I like these. You know, I like having the speakers on, but this to me is really the nuts and bolts of it. This is when it gets beautiful, when we're all sharing our own perspective on this. Because it's, and I know I've shared it before, I won't get into it too much, but it's like that analogy I talked about when you set up a movie projector in an open field. When you turn it on, you don't see anything. There's no picture. But if you have even the smallest little piece of paper and you hold it up there, you get to see part of that picture. And that's like our view on, you know, when we have an insight, we get another little piece of paper, we get a bigger one. But my piece of paper is over here, and yours is over here, and that person's is over there, another one over here. We all have a different view of the same picture. And together, it helps create more of a whole. And if we put all of our pieces of paper together, we get a bigger picture. That's the beauty of it. We can all share our insights and benefit from it together. So I love y'all. Thank you so much for
say,
yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Very
Thank you.
Thanks,
Enjoyed
guys.
it.
nice feeling, really.
Have a beautiful day.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for sharing, Patty.
Yeah.
You too.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.